Slightly less tawdry affair, but also not great. Disgraceful situation over there at CNN. We have new details.
Got another update.
About exactly why Jeff Zucker and his mistress, Allison Gollust, were ultimately fired. Let's put this tear sheet up on the screen. CNN executive, that's Allison Gollust, was ousted after discussing interview topics with Andrew Cuomo, who was governor. An internal investigation found that a top executive, Allison Gollust, had extensive communications with then Governor Andrew Cuomo. Effectively, this piece just confirms what we all completely expected. Because you'll recall, Allison Gollust was not only a top executive at CNN, expected to take over that network after Zucker left, she had previously served as an aide to Andrew Cuomo. So we knew that they were connected and had ties. What the New York Times is saying here is that before interviews, she would correspond with Cuomo and get from him what he wanted the interview topics to be. She would pass it along to the team and his brother, who was conducting the interviews, and then they would all go according to the script. So here's some of the specifics from the report. They say, this is the lead, they say, on a Saturday in March 2020, as COVID-19 was invading the U.S., Governor Cuomo went on CNN for a live interview. Among other topics, he was asked about a possible government-enforced quarantine of New York that had been floated by President Trump. It was a newsworthy topic, but its path onto viewers' screens would turn out to be controversial and highly consequential for the future of one of the world's most powerful news networks. Before the interview, Cuomo had told senior executive Allison Gollust about subjects he'd like to be asked about on air. Ms. Gollust then passed along the topics to CNN producers and reported back to the governor, done, she wrote. They found a massive cache of communications exchanges between Gollust and Cuomo. There were multiple times where, every single topic that the governor wanted to be asked about, they reviewed the transcripts, and sure enough, he gets asked about them.
Does it.
And just so and let's go ahead and put this Ken Vogel tweet up on the screen. This is the kicker. Right. This is the kicker of this whole piece. The internal investigation's findings are especially notable because CNN journalists have repeatedly attacked Fox News personalities like Sean Hannity for having an overly close relationship with Republican leaders, in particular Mr. Trump. Brian Stelter wrote an entire book
about it.
About that. And it's a worthy topic of consideration, but somehow, now when it comes to CNN, their anchors, when this is all exposed, they're not upset that their own bosses were engaged in the same behavior. They're just upset that the corrupt bosses were let go. So it's pretty extraordinary. And, not a lot of details here about exactly what Zucker's involvement was, but I think you can surmise, given the relationship between him and Gollust and his own coziness with the Cuomos, that he also knew what was going on. And the whole cover story about, I resigned because of this affair. No one cared about the affair. This was the real thing that was going on.
I mean, this is outwardly and blatantly corrupt. And actually, it almost makes me feel bad for Chris Cuomo because he's like, hey, you fired me. You knew what was up.
Right.
And not only that, you helped me. You were also just as complicit in using our platform to cover, to not only cover for, but in order to boost my brother's public profile. And what they point to specifically, like you laid out, it's unbelievable because you have it right there in writing. That it'll be like, the governor wants to be asked about this. And she replies, done.
Done.
I mean, what? Like, look, you have to disclose that. I mean, they should not be scripting your interviews. I mean, you can say like, hey, he would love to be able to do this, but they're outright just saying, hey, he wants to be asked about this because he wants to make this announcement on your show. And they're like, oh yeah, absolutely. And not only that, helping craft his public statements and using so much of their platform in order to boost his image at this time, remember, of how critical this was whenever old people were dying in nursing homes.
Well, and I think we should explain to people how this process works because what they're saying is, this is standard protocol. There's always communications between guests and between the team about what the interview subject is going to be. And there is, obviously, when you're booking someone, there's some conversation about, hey, here's generally the topic and what we're going to cover. But for the subject of the interview, especially a powerful public official who was being floated as a presidential contender at the time, for that person to dictate the terms of the interview, no.
Yeah.
No, that is not remotely acceptable. That is way beyond the bounds of any sort of journalistic ethics. Just imagine if the shoe's on the other foot. And I mean, I think this probably did happen over at Fox News, where Trump says, hey, I want you to ask this, this, and this. Everybody would see this is blatantly corrupt. You are supposed to be there to hold power to account, not to recite the scripted questions that they have prepared for you. That is literally like state media level propaganda that they're trying to pass off as, no, this is standard journalism. This is how we do things.
You know, it actually reminds me a couple times. So I can tell you, before I interviewed Trump, there's always a negotiation process. They're like, we would really like to ask you ask about the border. And I'm like, yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe I will. I'll give you straight up. They also tell you, we don't want you to ask about this. So my very last interview with Trump, it was a day, I forgot her name. E. Jean Carroll, who was, I think she was famous or something like that. And she accused Trump of rape. And so before we walked in there, Sarah Sanders takes me and the other guy who was interviewing Trump with aside. And they're like, don't ask about E. Jean Carroll. We were like, yeah, we didn't say anything. We're like, yeah, sure. And, you know, and then at the end, we were like, so what about E. Jean Carroll?
Yeah.
And he wanted to talk about it, by the way. So he gives us this, I can't remember. He goes, first of all, she's not my type, which is certainly
classic Trump.
Classic Trump. But that ends up leading the news, and we're on our way out. She's like, you just had to ask about that. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing my job.
It's your job.
It's my job. We can also give you insight here. We've tried to book politicians on this show, and their office is like, well, he only wants to talk about this. And we'll be like, well, we're not gonna only stick to that. So take it or leave it. And they leave it. And well, I won't tell you who it is, but that happens more often than you would think. A lot of times these politicians will say, well, this is what we want to talk about, because their press office and all these people are trying to push this narrative. And hey, look, if I find it interesting, yeah, okay, we can talk. But everything is on the table. If we want it to be on the table. That is always a massive point of contention anytime you interview a politician. It's also why we are very reluctant usually in order to book them whenever they try to push that, because we have our conditions very clearly. If you come on this show, we will ask you whatever we want, and hence a lot of them don't necessarily want to come on, which is part of the issue.
You have to go into the interview assuming that this person is never going to come back.
Yeah, right, yeah. And that's a real problem.
It is, and these people who are going to give those politicians exactly the interview they want are part of the problem. Because if their expectation was, no matter where I go and no matter what journalist I sit with, I'm going to get asked tough questions, then they wouldn't have the luxury of just like denying access to anyone who's going to put a difficult question to them. But when you have, you know, the head of the network and his mistress playing, you know, giving you, okay, yes, we'll give you exactly what you want in the interview, and your freaking brother is going to conduct it. That was the only place that he did interviews effectively. So they had this exclusive access to him that they protected by giving him exactly the scripted topic questions that he ultimately wanted. So it not only harms, obviously, the coverage at CNN, but it's part of a bigger problem that makes it so that, you know, then no journalist feels like they can ask a tough question because that person is never ultimately going to come back to them. And there are only a very few. Basically nowhere is exempt. Maybe the New York Times, because they're so big. Maybe the Washington Post.
I don't think so.
But independent outlets like us, even random cable news shows, random Sunday shows, these politicians don't feel like they have to ask tough questions about, answer tough questions about anything, that they can just go on and get their sort of like, you know, patty cake scripted puff pieces from their journalists of choice. And the sad thing is that those people who do those patty cakes interviews are exactly the ones who get promoted because they get access, because they get these little scooplets, because they're playing in the circle of the people that they see as their peers, rather than actually doing their job of holding power to account at a time that was absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it makes our job hard, right? When we're like, we don't want to do that type of the whole point of this show is that we're not cable and we don't feed into that stuff. And then the politicians don't want to come on, miraculously, because that's part of the issue. And, you know, it goes to the real fear of being and put in an environment where you have to be a normal person. This is why it's always so funny. Sometimes people, cutouts, will approach me to be like, so-and-so wants to go on Rogan. I'm like, that's not going to happen for you, dude. But number one, you are not an authentic person. You don't have 3 hours of things to say. He would tear you apart. I don't mean in a mean way. It's like if you had to sit there and try to reveal to the world who you really were with your scripted answers, it would just fall apart instantly.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're only made
do
for the
that for
cable
8
news.
minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're only made for the cable news edifice. It all starts to fall apart once you meet. And if you ever meet any of these guys in person, it's very, or women, it's totally,
Yes.
gender neutral when it comes to the
Yes.
what the swamp really looks like. Yeah, look, CNN giving us, everybody in the business, a bad name. I will reiterate again, their talent is not upset about this. Their talent is upset that they got fired for doing this. They are just as corrupt. So whenever they accuse anybody else, just remind them that they're guilty of the exact same thing. And they didn't actually care. What they really care about is ratings, tearing the country apart, and demonizing the other side. Also, they can make money. They're shameless. They want to be famous. That's all they care about in this world, and they're really just ruining this country.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut. Our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions. All that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.